Naomi's new beginning. Naomi adjusted the strap of her black cocktail dress, her reflection in the mirror showing a confident woman ready for the night ahead. Her best friend, Leah, had dragged her to this party, insisting she needed a break from the grind of work and endless goals. Naomi, a young paralegal with dreams of law school, rarely made time for herself. Her life had always been about the next step, the next milestone. Graduate from college, get a stable job, save money for law school. The routine left little room for personal indulgence, and Naomi had convinced herself that work was her only path to success. But tonight was different. Leah had practically begged her to attend this networking event, a casual evening meant to connect young professionals in the city. Leah swore it would be good for her and insisted that Naomi needed a break. Despite her reluctance, Naomi had agreed. She had even gone so far as to buy a new dress for the occasion, something black and sleek, a dress she would never have chosen had it not been for Leah's persistence. The hum of conversations and the clinking of wine glasses filled the air as Naomi entered the venue. It was a lavish space, with large windows showcasing the city skyline and low, soft lighting creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. Naomi felt out of place. She wasn't used to these events. They always seemed superficial to her. Networking, small talk, people schmoozing for connections, it all felt draining. But she promised Leah she would give it a chance. As she moved through the crowd, her eyes wandered, taking in the well-dressed attendees and their animated conversations. Naomi took a long sip of her wine, trying to relax, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being the odd one out. She barely knew anyone here, and she was far more accustomed to late-night work sessions than this kind of socializing. That was when she saw him. Richard. He stood across the room, tall and imposing, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. His sharp jawline was effortlessly defined, and his tailored suit seemed to scream privilege. His posture radiated confidence. He didn't just occupy space. He owned it. Naomi's eyes lingered on him for a moment, captivated by his commanding presence. But what struck her most were his eyes. Piercing blue, almost too intense for a stranger. They held a quiet curiosity, an unspoken invitation to engage. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt both drawn to and unnerved by him at the same time. Before she could look away, Richard's gaze locked with hers. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Naomi was caught off guard. She hadn't expected to be noticed in such a sea of people. He moved effortlessly through the crowd, his eyes never leaving hers. As he approached, Naomi tried to regain her composure. She set her wine glass down, her heart inexplicably racing. There was something magnetic about him, something both thrilling and intimidating. She wasn't used to feeling this way, not in a crowd of strangers, and certainly not over a man she hadn't even spoken to yet. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his voice smooth, like warm honey. It was calm but carried an undeniable confidence. Naomi blinked, taken aback by how direct he was. "Trying to," she replied, forcing a smile. "It's a little overwhelming, to be honest." Richard chuckled lightly, a sound that seemed to resonate with Naomi in a way she didn't expect. "I get it. It's easy to feel out of place in a crowd like this." He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the gathering, before returning to Naomi. "But you seem different. I've noticed you from across the room. There's a certain confidence about you. Not everyone has that, especially in an environment like this." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially not from someone so effortlessly self-assured. He grinned, a knowing look flashing in his eyes. "Definitely." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with genuine interest. "Tell me, what brings someone like you to an event like this?" Naomi found herself laughing softly, her guard slowly lowering as she conversed with him. She hadn't expected someone like Richard to be so engaging, so easy to talk to. "My friend dragged me here," She's convinced that I need to network and make connections. But honestly, I'm just here because I promised her I would show up." Richard's lips quirked into a smile. "Promises to friends are important," he said, his voice casual but sincere. "But I think you're more than just here because of a promise. I can see it in the way you carry yourself. You might not want to be here, but you're the type who'll make the most of it anyway." Naomi blinked, a little stunned by his insight. It wasn't often that people saw her for more than just the professional exterior she worked so hard to maintain. Richard seemed to understand her in a way no one else had in a long time. "Maybe you're right," she admitted, the words slipping out more honestly than she intended. "I'm always so focused on the next step that sometimes I forget to just enjoy the moment." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I can relate to that. The constant drive to succeed, to achieve more, it's exhausting. But I think the key is balancing ambition with enjoyment. That's where the real fulfillment comes from." There was a quiet intensity to Richard, an awareness that Naomi wasn't used to in a casual setting like this. It wasn't just that he was charming. He was perceptive, thoughtful. It intrigued her, pulled her in further. They continued talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly from one topic to the next. Naomi found herself laughing more than she had in months. She talked about her career ambitions, her dreams of law school, and the sacrifices she had made to get where she was. Richard listened intently, offering thoughtful advice and perspectives. "Law school, huh? That's a tough path," Richard said, his tone acknowledging the weight of her aspirations. "But I can see it in you. You're driven. You'll make it. And when you do, you'll have this incredible foundation to build on." Naomi felt a flicker of hope rise within her, hearing those words come from someone who didn't just see her as a paralegal, but as someone with a future. She had grown so accustomed to the pressure to succeed on her own that hearing someone believe in her without reservations felt different. It felt empowering. Richard smiled, his eyes glinting with something Naomi couldn't quite place. "You know, if you ever want someone to talk to or just bounce ideas off of, I'm here. I know how tough it can get, trying to break into a field like law. But trust me, you've got what it takes." Naomi didn't know what to say at first. She hadn't expected this kind of support, especially from someone she had just met. But in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the beginning of something. Something she hadn't been expecting but couldn't ignore. She had spent so long chasing goals, running from one achievement to the next, that she hadn't stopped to realize how much she wanted companionship, support, someone who could share her dreams and challenges. By the time the night ended, Naomi was reluctant to leave. Richard had made her feel seen, heard, and understood in a way no one had before. He asked for her number, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Naomi handed it to him. "I'll call you," he said sincerely, his voice carrying a promise. Naomi smiled, a flutter of excitement stirring within her chest. "I'll be waiting to hear from you." As she left the event that night, Naomi felt a sense of warmth she hadn't realized she had been missing. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility of something more than just her career, her goals, and her ambitions. She didn't know where things would go with Richard, but for the first time in ages, she felt open to the idea of something unexpected. She had promised herself to take control of her future, but maybe, just maybe, this new chapter could include a partner, someone who believed in her, someone who saw her for who she really was. As she headed home that night, Naomi knew her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Naomi's rising doubts. Naomi spent the following days caught in a whirlwind of thoughts, all swirling around the night she had met Richard. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation they had shared, how easily it flowed, how comfortable he had made her feel. His words of encouragement replayed in her mind like a gentle echo. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that for the first time in a long time, someone had seen her, not just as a paralegal working her way through the legal field, but as a person with dreams and aspirations beyond her 9-to-5. Still, despite the warmth that Richard had brought into her life, doubts crept in. Naomi had learned long ago that things were never as perfect as they seemed, and her history had taught her to remain cautious, to protect her heart from getting too involved too quickly. Her past relationships, particularly with men who didn't understand her drive or her need for independence, had left scars. Scars she wasn't sure she was ready to expose again. As much as she wanted to believe that Richard could be different, she couldn't ignore the part of her that told her to be careful. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, pushing through long hours, sacrifice, and personal doubts. Her dreams of law school, her determination to rise above the ordinary, were all she had. Was she ready to let someone else in? A week passed before Richard reached out to her. His message was simple yet warm. "I hope you're doing well, Naomi. I've been thinking about our conversation last week. Would love to grab coffee sometime and continue where we left off. Let me know if you're free." Naomi stared at the text for a long time, her finger hovering over the reply button. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Maybe something grand, some deeper explanation of who Richard really was, or why he'd been so interested in her. But the message was casual, almost like a continuation of their earlier connection. She took a deep breath, debating with herself whether to respond or ignore it. In the end, she decided to reply. "Coffee sounds great. I'm free tomorrow afternoon. Where would you like to meet?" The moment she pressed send, her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how much she had been anticipating this moment until now. Naomi knew she had to remain grounded, reminding herself that this wasn't some fairy tale romance, but just a conversation between two people trying to get to know each other. Still, her curiosity was piqued, and her thoughts began to race. The next day, they met at a small cafe near the city center. The atmosphere was cozy, with a gentle hum of background chatter and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Naomi arrived early, trying to calm the flutter of nerves in her stomach. She ordered a latte and found a quiet corner to sit, her mind working overtime. What if this was all just another distraction? What if Richard was only interested in her because of her ambition, something to tick off on his list of projects? When Richard finally arrived, Naomi's breath caught in her throat. He looked even more striking in person than he had at the party. Tall, with his sandy brown hair neatly styled, and a dark jacket that hugged his frame perfectly. His presence seemed to fill the room, and when his eyes found hers, that same spark of curiosity and warmth flickered. "Hi, Naomi," Richard greeted with a smile, his voice carrying an easy confidence. "It's good to see you again." "Likewise," Naomi replied, feeling a slight twinge of nervousness. She stood to greet him, and they exchanged a polite hug before sitting down across from each other. As they began to talk, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about Richard. It wasn't just the way he spoke or the ease with which he engaged her. It was the way he listened, truly listened, to everything she said. Naomi was used to people nodding along to her conversations, offering half-hearted comments or suggestions, but Richard was different. He asked questions, followed up on her thoughts, and genuinely seemed invested in what she had to say. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," Richard began, his eyes narrowing slightly as he reflected on their previous conversation. "You mentioned wanting to go to law school, but that it feels like an endless grind. What's been holding you back from making it happen?" Naomi hesitated. The question was simple, but it made her feel vulnerable, like she was opening up a part of herself she wasn't ready to share. She had always kept her dreams and frustrations about her career to herself. Talking about it out loud felt almost like an admission of failure, something she wasn't ready to confront. "Well," she began slowly, looking down at her latte, "I guess I'm just not sure if I can handle it all. I've been working nonstop, and while I love what I do, I know law school is going to take everything I have. I want it, but I don't know if I can handle it all. I've been putting so much pressure on myself, and sometimes I wonder if I'm really cut out for it." Richard studied her for a moment, his expression serious yet understanding. "I think you're more than cut out for it, but I get it. Sometimes, the hardest part is deciding whether you're ready to give everything up for something you're not even sure is guaranteed. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms thoughtfully. But maybe that's the thing. Sometimes, you've got to take that leap of faith. You're not supposed to have it all figured out. That's the beauty of it. Naomi took a deep breath, absorbing his words. She had heard similar things before, but something about the way Richard spoke made them feel more significant. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and wondered if he truly understood her. There was something magnetic about him, something compelling that made her want to believe in his words. But still, the doubts gnawed at her. Was she putting too much stock in this connection, this moment? Could she trust herself to open up to him in a way that wouldn't jeopardize her independence? Before she could dwell too much on her thoughts, Richard's voice broke through her reverie. I know this may sound forward, but... He paused, his gaze softening. I think you've got so much potential, and I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You don't have to figure it all out alone. If you ever need someone to talk to or just to help you see things more clearly, I'm here for you. Naomi froze, her heart racing. She had never been someone to lean on others, and yet the offer felt like a lifeline. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Richard's words were sincere, but they also felt like an invitation to something more, something beyond just coffee and conversation. As the conversation continued, Naomi found herself opening up to Richard more than she had anticipated. The usual walls she kept up when talking about her career, her dreams, and even her fears seemed to melt away in his presence. His warmth, his steady gaze, and the way he encouraged her made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything on her own. Yet, as the meeting drew to a close, Naomi couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on staying focused on her goals without getting distracted by outside influences. Could she trust Richard? Could she allow herself to rely on someone, let alone someone who seemed to carry so much of his own ambition and success? As they said their goodbyes and Naomi walked away from the cafe, she felt a sense of unease settle over her. The connection she had with Richard was undeniable, but was it enough to make her open her heart again? The next few days passed in a blur, Naomi going back to her usual routine of work, bills, and occasional thoughts of Richard. But with each passing day, the questions lingered. Could she trust this new connection? Was it real, or was she just letting herself be swept away by something that might not last? Her doubts remained unresolved, but one thing was clear. Naomi was at a crossroads. Whatever path she chose next would require more than just ambition or drive. It would require trust. And that, more than anything else, was the hardest thing to give. The tipping point. The weeks that followed Richard's offer to help Naomi were a blur of conflicting emotions. Naomi found herself thinking about him more and more. Even though she had tried to keep her distance, she hadn't expected things to move this quickly. And now she felt as though she was teetering on the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She was juggling the demands of her career, the weight of her dreams, and her relationship with Richard, all while trying to maintain the independence she had worked so hard to cultivate. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing curveballs. One afternoon, as Naomi was leaving work, she received a phone call that shifted everything. "Naomi, it's Mom. We need to talk." Her mother's voice sounded urgent, almost frantic. Naomi's stomach twisted. Her mother rarely called her at this hour unless something was wrong. "I've been trying to reach you. Your father, well, he's not doing well. He's been in and out of the hospital lately, and I think it's time we make some decisions." Naomi's heart sank. Her father had been sick for years, but this time it felt different. She could hear the worry in her mother's voice, a sense of finality that made Naomi's chest tighten with dread. "I'll come home tonight, Mom," she said, trying to sound calm, even though she felt far from it. By the time Naomi arrived at her parents' home later that evening, the house felt heavy, as though it were holding its breath. Her mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, though the meal seemed to go unnoticed. The usual warmth of the home had been replaced by a quiet tension that made Naomi feel like an outsider. She walked up to her mother and gently put a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, what's going on? Is Dad okay?" Naomi asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Her mother turned to her, her eyes swollen from a mixture of tears and lack of sleep. "Naomi, your father's heart isn't strong enough anymore. We've been to the doctors, and they say there's nothing more they can do." She paused, as if trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to spill over. "I need you, Naomi. We need you to be here, with us." Naomi stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her mother's words sinking in. She had known her father's health had been deteriorating, but hearing it said so plainly brought it all into sharp focus. This was real. This was happening. "I'm here, Mom," Naomi said, trying to reassure her mother. But deep inside, she was already pulling away. She had always been the strong one, the one who took care of things. But this time, she couldn't help but feel like she was losing control. After a quiet dinner with her parents, Naomi went to bed early, hoping for some rest. But sleep didn't come. Her mind was too busy, too full of thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness, and her heart ached for her father, for her mother, for everything that was slipping through her fingers. And then there was Richard, who had been a comforting presence in her life, but now felt like an inconvenient distraction. She hadn't been able to see him as much lately, and it seemed that every time she did try to make time for him, there was something pulling her away. The next morning, she received a text from Richard. "Hey, Naomi. I was thinking about you last night. Is everything okay?" His message was sweet, but Naomi couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of guilt. She had been so distant, caught up in her own world, that she hadn't even considered what Richard might be feeling. For a moment, she wondered if he was starting to get frustrated with her, if he was beginning to see the cracks in her carefully constructed armor. She quickly typed a response. "I'm okay. Just dealing with some family stuff. I'll explain later." But even as she sent it, she knew that it wasn't entirely true. She wasn't okay. Not really. And her family situation wasn't the only thing weighing on her. It was the realization that she was no longer sure of herself, of what she wanted, or even of who she was becoming. The following week passed in a blur of hospital visits and family meetings. Naomi found herself split between her mother's house and the hospital, trying to balance her responsibilities while still keeping up with her demanding job. She was barely sleeping, barely eating. The exhaustion was beginning to take its toll, and yet she couldn't bring herself to slow down. Her father's condition was deteriorating faster than anyone had expected, and with each passing day, Naomi felt the weight of her choices growing heavier. In the midst of all this, Richard remained patient. He called her each day, checking in and offering his support. But Naomi couldn't bring herself to open up to him, to let him in on the depth of what she was feeling. Instead, she pushed him further away, afraid that if she allowed him to get too close, it would only complicate things. She couldn't afford complications right now. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, Naomi collapsed on her couch, too exhausted to do anything but stare blankly at the wall. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from Richard. "I miss you. I know things are tough right now, but I'm here for you. Just let me know when you're ready to talk." The words were simple, but they hit Naomi like a wave crashing against the shore. She could feel the sincerity in his message, the care in his words. It was more than just an offer of support. It was an invitation to lean on him, to trust him. But Naomi wasn't sure she could. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let anyone into her world, not even someone like Richard. The emotional toll of her father's illness, the strain on her relationship with her mother, and the pressure of keeping her life together had drained her. And now, as much as Richard seemed like a safe haven, Naomi couldn't escape the nagging voice in her head telling her that allowing herself to be vulnerable was too risky. The following morning, as Naomi sat in her car outside her parents' house, her phone rang. It was Richard. "Naomi, hey. I've been thinking about everything you've been going through, and I just wanted to check in. I don't want to add any more stress, but I also want to be here for you," Richard said, his voice calm yet filled with concern. Naomi closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the steering wheel, as she took a deep breath. This was the moment where everything could change. "I appreciate that, Richard," Naomi began, her voice shaky, "but I don't know if I can keep doing this. I've got so much going on, and I'm not sure how much I can give right now. My family needs me, and I'm not sure if I can be there for you the way you deserve." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Richard spoke. "Naomi, I get it. I know this is a lot, but I don't want you to feel like you're burdening me. I care about you, and I want to support you through this. I just need you to be honest with me, okay? Tell me what you need." Naomi's chest tightened. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she needed someone to truly understand, someone to give her the space to fall apart and still be there when she was ready to rebuild. But was she ready for that? Could she allow herself to depend on Richard, even if it meant risking her independence? "I don't know, Richard," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I can let you in." The silence between them stretched on, and Naomi felt the weight of her words settle in. Was she making the right choice? She wasn't sure anymore, but one thing was certain. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, and the world outside seemed both terrifying and inviting at the same time. As the days passed, Naomi's inner turmoil only deepened. She had come so far on her own, built herself up from nothing. But now the question remained, was she ready to share her burdens with someone else? And more importantly, could she trust herself to make that decision without losing who she was in the process? For the first time, Naomi felt the tug of something deeper than ambition, something that could change her life forever. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to take that leap. The breaking point. As the days grew longer, Naomi's life seemed to spiral out of control, no matter how hard she tried to hold it all together. She had always been the one to manage everything. Her career, her dreams, her family's needs. But now, with each passing day, she felt herself coming undone. The weight of her father's deteriorating health, her strained relationship with Richard, and the relentless pressure of her job had turned into a constant, suffocating presence in her life. Her mother's calls had become more frequent, and Naomi could feel the exhaustion in her voice. She was doing her best to be strong for her father, but Naomi knew it was becoming too much for her. She felt guilty for not being there more, for not being able to take the burden off her mother's shoulders. But no matter how much she tried, Naomi felt like she was falling short. She could no longer compartmentalize everything. The stress, the worry, the resentment that had started to creep in. It was all too much. Richard had been patient, more patient than Naomi could have ever hoped for. But she felt a deep sense of guilt for the distance that had grown between them. He had tried to reach out, to offer his support, but each time she felt her walls grow higher. She had pushed him away without meaning to, caught in the trap of her own pride and fear. The one time she had allowed herself to break down in front of him, she had regretted it immediately. They had been sitting at a cafe after one of her hospital visits, and Naomi had been unusually quiet. Richard, sensing her turmoil, reached across the table and took her hand gently. "You don't have to do this alone, Naomi," he said softly, his eyes filled with concern. Naomi pulled her hand away, feeling a lump form in her throat. She couldn't let him in. She had been doing it all on her own for so long, and to let someone else share that weight felt like surrendering. "I'm fine, Richard. I don't need your pity," she snapped, immediately regretting the harshness of her tone. Richard's face fell, and Naomi instantly regretted her words. She hadn't meant to hurt him. She had only been trying to protect herself. But the damage was done. Richard, hurt and unsure, had quietly excused himself and left her sitting alone in the cafe, feeling smaller than she ever had before. The next few days passed in a haze. Naomi couldn't bring herself to apologize to Richard, nor could she shake the feeling of isolation that had begun to settle in her heart. She had always prided herself on being strong, but now, in the face of everything, she felt weak and broken. Every time she tried to move forward, something else seemed to pull her back into the chaos. And yet, despite all of it, Naomi couldn't let herself cry. She couldn't afford to. She couldn't let anyone see the cracks in her armor. Her father's condition worsened by the day, and soon the doctors told them that it was only a matter of time. Naomi knew that the end was near, but hearing those words from a medical professional made it all too real. Her father was slipping away from her, and no matter how hard she tried to stay focused on her responsibilities, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of helplessness. One night, as she sat beside her father's bed, her mother came in, looking worn out and drained. Naomi watched as her mother gently adjusted the blankets around her father, her hands trembling as she did so. The sight of her mother, who had always been so strong, brought a lump to Naomi's throat. She could feel the pain in her heart growing, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. Her mother sat down beside her, pulling her into a comforting embrace. "It's okay, Naomi," she whispered, though her voice was thick with sorrow. "We'll get through this. We always do." Naomi buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her body racked with sobs. She didn't know how much more she could take. Her father was slipping away. Her relationship with Richard was on the rocks, and she couldn't find a way to balance it all. It was as though the world was collapsing around her, and she was powerless to stop it. The next day, as Naomi arrived at the hospital for another long day of sitting by her father's bedside, she received a text from Richard. She hadn't seen him in nearly a week, and despite the tension between them, she couldn't help but feel a pang of longing when she saw his name. "Naomi, I know things have been hard for you lately, but I need to talk to you. I can't keep pretending everything's fine between us. Please, call me when you get the chance." Naomi's heart sank. She knew what this meant. Richard was done waiting. He had given her space, allowed her time to deal with everything. But now he was asking for something more. He wanted her to be vulnerable, to let him in, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure if she ever would be. The thought of losing Richard, of letting go of the one thing in her life that had been a source of comfort, made her stomach turn. But she couldn't bring herself to reach out. Her father needed her mother needed her, and Naomi didn't have room for anything else. She couldn't afford to focus on Richard's needs when her family's needs were so much greater. That night, after another grueling day at the hospital, Naomi finally broke. She had spent the entire day at her father's side, watching as his condition grew worse with each passing hour. Her mother had stepped out to grab some food, leaving Naomi alone with her father. The room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the machines monitoring his vitals. Naomi took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves. Her father, who had been a pillar of strength in her life, was now so frail, so small in that hospital bed. She reached out and took his hand, her heart aching at the thought of losing him. "I don't know what to do, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've tried so hard to be strong, but I feel like I'm failing everyone. I can't even keep my own life together." She paused, fighting back tears. "I don't know how much more I can take." As if hearing her, her father's eyes fluttered open. He was weak, barely able to speak, but his gaze locked onto hers, and she could see the love in his eyes. His voice was barely a whisper, but Naomi heard every word. "You're stronger than you think, Naomi. Don't ever forget that." Naomi squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I don't feel strong, Dad. I feel like I'm falling apart." Her father smiled faintly, his hand giving hers a final squeeze. "You're going to get through this. You always have." The next morning, Naomi's father passed away. The hospital room was filled with silence, the weight of his absence settling into Naomi's bones. She had known this day was coming, but no amount of preparation could have prepared her for the overwhelming flood of grief that engulfed her. For the first time, she felt utterly powerless. And in the days that followed, As she navigated the sorrow of losing her father, Naomi realized something. She could no longer keep pushing away the people who cared about her. The walls she had built around herself, the isolation she had embraced for so long, had only served to hold her back. She needed to open her heart, to let the people who cared about her help carry her burdens. And so, with a heavy heart, Naomi finally reached out to Richard. The decision that changes everything. The days following Naomi and Richard's heart-wrenching conversation were filled with uncertainty. Naomi had promised herself that she would start over, that she would make space for Richard in her life again. But the reality of her situation was far from easy. Her responsibilities at home, the mounting pressure of her mother's health, and the looming uncertainty about her future were all consuming. Every morning, she awoke with a sense of dread, wondering how she was going to manage it all. Richard, on the other hand, gave her the time and space she needed. He didn't push for immediate changes or expect her to dive back into their relationship headfirst. He allowed her the room to heal, to reconnect with herself and her family. Naomi appreciated his patience, but part of her felt guilty. She knew that Richard wasn't just sitting idly by. He was waiting, hoping, but she could sense the distance growing again. One particular evening, as she sat in her mother's dimly lit living room, a hospital bill sitting on the coffee table in front of her, Naomi felt her strength waning. She was exhausted. Her mother had been growing weaker with each passing day, and Naomi's own health was beginning to suffer as well. She hadn't been sleeping, and when she did, her dreams were filled with the relentless pressure of her obligations. Her mind raced with thoughts of everything she still had to do: her mother's medication, doctor's appointments, arranging for help, and somehow making time for herself in the process. It felt impossible. Richard called her that evening, just as she was staring at the mounting pile of bills. His voice, warm and familiar, brought a small sense of comfort. "Hey," Richard said, his tone light. "How are you holding up?" Naomi sighed, closing her eyes as she let his voice wash over her. It had been too long since she had let herself feel truly heard. "I'm tired, Richard. I feel like I'm drowning. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Richard's voice softened. "I know it's hard. I can't pretend to understand what you're going through. But I want to be here for you. Let me help, Naomi. Please. You don't have to carry all this weight by yourself." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. The tears she had been holding back for weeks began to well up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. "I don't know how to accept your help anymore. I feel like I've pushed you away for too long. I'm afraid that if I let you in, I'll lose everything." "You won't lose me," Richard replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "You won't lose me, Naomi. We're in this together, if you'll let me. You have to let me help you." There was a long pause before Naomi spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Richard. I'm scared of being vulnerable. I'm scared of trusting someone else again." Richard's words were firm but gentle. "I don't want you to be scared anymore. You don't have to be. You're not alone. Let me be the one who holds you up when you can't stand. Let me be the one who helps you find your balance again." Naomi felt a rush of emotion at his words. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine what life could be like if she accepted Richard's offer. What if she didn't have to do it all alone? What if she could lean on him without feeling like she was failing? It was a thought that terrified her, but it also filled her with a quiet hope. She was tired of carrying the weight of everything on her shoulders. She was tired of pretending that she could do it all. Maybe it was time to let go of her fear and allow someone in. "I want to try," Naomi said softly, her voice trembling. "I want to try, Richard, but I don't know how." Richard's answer was immediate, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "We'll take it one step at a time. I'm not asking for everything all at once, Naomi. Just trust me. Let me show you that you don't have to do it alone." The next few weeks were a delicate dance of rediscovery. Naomi moved into Richard's apartment, a decision that seemed monumental but necessary. It was a decision that would force her to confront the emotion she had buried deep inside herself, but she was ready. In the mornings, she would visit her mother, taking care of her as best as she could. Richard made sure to carve out time for them both, whether it was cooking a simple dinner together or watching a movie late at night. They were small moments, but they were meaningful. Richard never pushed Naomi to talk about her struggles, but he was always there, a steady presence in her life. He would sit with her during doctor's appointments, offer to help with household chores, and listen when she needed to vent. And slowly, Naomi began to realize that she wasn't the only one carrying the burden anymore. They were sharing it together. There was no grand transformation, no sudden shift in their lives, but Naomi could feel the change. It was happening, slowly but surely. However, life was never that simple. As Naomi tried to balance her responsibilities to her mother, her career, and her relationship with Richard, she encountered new challenges. Her mother's condition worsened, and Naomi found herself spending more and more time at the hospital, leaving Richard to pick up the slack. It wasn't long before she found herself stretched thin again, juggling too many things at once. The fear of losing everything she held dear began to creep back in, and Naomi started pulling away again. Richard could sense the change, but he refused to let her isolate herself. One night, after Naomi had spent hours at the hospital, Richard found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She hadn't said a word all evening, and he knew something was wrong. "Naomi," Richard said gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to explain the storm that was swirling inside her. She didn't want to disappoint him again, but she could feel the walls closing in. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I'm so tired, Richard. I feel like I'm failing." Richard sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "You're not failing. You're just trying to do too much. You can't fix everything on your own. You don't have to carry the world by yourself. Let me help. Let me be the one who picks up the pieces when you can't." Naomi looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared that if I let go, I'll lose everything. I'm scared that I'll lose you." Richard squeezed her hand, his voice steady and confident. "You're not going to lose me, Naomi. I'm right here. And I'll be here for you, no matter what. We'll get through this together." In that moment, Naomi felt the last of her walls crumble. She had been holding on to her fear for so long, but now she was ready to let it go. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Richard, and together, they could face whatever came next.